In Farming Simulator 25, animals play a much bigger role than you might think. That's why in this video, we'll take a look at all 8 species to figure out which ones actually make sense to keep and which are just a waste of your time. I've divided them into 3 categories: cheap, easy, and plenty. And let me tell you, not everything is as obvious as it seems. It might seem clear that the cheapest animal is the best choice, but this is exactly where the game tricks us. So let's start with the first category. Of course, cheap. By that, I mean which animal you can start raising with the smallest budget. Right away, we can cross dairy cows and buffalo off the list, because to produce milk, you need a barn that costs over $250,000. That's a bit ridiculous because in real life, I've seen barns that cost just a fraction of that, and farmers were still producing milk successfully. But hey, let's remember this is just Farming Simulator. So in this scenario, dairy cows and buffalo get a solid 1 out of 10 from me. What's funny though is that the barn, or rather the pasture for sheep and goats, costs about 14 times less, only 14,000. And goats produce milk. Here's the surprise: goat milk appears on pallets, while cow milk goes into a tank you have to pump it out of. I probably don't need to explain that in real life. Cow milk could easily be stored in barrels too. But let's get back to the topic of cheapness. When it comes to sheep and goats, besides that 14,000 pasture, you'll also need a small vehicle for around 12,000 and a water tank. And theoretically, that's all you need to start making money, since goats feed on grass from the pasture. Except, not really. Yes, once you deliver water, they'll start producing milk, but even a pallet with just a few liters of milk can't be lifted by hand unless of course you have a super strength mod. But we're not counting mods here. So again, a situation that would be trivial in real life, grabbing a milk jug and taking it to sell, becomes much more complicated in the game. Instead of a car, you'll need a tractor and a pallet loader. Technically, your small vehicle supports a 3-point hitch, but it doesn't work very well, so that option's out. Even with the tractor, it's still relatively cheap, but it could be cheaper. Of course, we're not counting grass collection here and assuming animals eat whatever's on their pasture, because in this category, what matters is cheapness. And that's why goats and sheep, which work basically the same way, get a solid 8 out of 10 from me. The situation is quite similar with beef cattle because they also only need a pasture. Their price keeps increasing over time, though once the pasture reaches its limit, the value starts to drop. But if you calculate everything right, this can actually be a pretty profitable business. It's a bit controversial, but I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Theoretically, it might seem obvious that chickens win this category without any debate. Their coop costs only $2,500. Compared to other animals, that's practically nothing. But we're not just talking about the cost of the coop and the animals themselves. To actually start raising them, you also need grain. And that's where things get less appealing because the cheapest combine harvester costs over $100,000, not to mention all the additional equipment required to grow crops. Sure, you could buy ready-to-harvest fields and sell them after collecting the grain, but we're talking about reasonable methods here. Technically, you can also buy pre-packaged chicken feed from the store, but by that logic, you could also buy silage for cows, so I'm not counting those shortcuts. That's why chickens get 4 out of 10 in this category. We can also add pigs to this group, because to start growing, they only need wheat, just like chickens. Their price gradually increases over time, although for some reason their health remains at 0. Still, since their value rises, it's possible to make some profit. However, since pigs don't reach full productivity this way, their pen is more expensive than the chicken coop, and they also require water. I'm giving them 1 point less, 3 out of 10. Now, time for the cherry on top, horses, which honestly surprised me in a good way, and for several reasons. First of all, and I still don't get why, the smaller horse pen is more than twice as cheap as the larger one, and it doesn't even require water. The only advantage of the more expensive pen is that it fits 2 additional horses, but even then, it's more profitable to just buy 2 of the cheaper ones. Maybe someone in the comments will solve this mystery, because I couldn't find any logical explanation for this difference. Another surprise was that horses aren't actually that expensive to maintain. Yes, their pen costs about 10 times more than a chicken coop, but the equipment needed to make hay doesn't cost a fortune. You can get everything done for around 100,000, even if you add a windrower, which isn't necessary but does make hay collection easier. However, hay alone doesn't give them 100% productivity. So in this category, horses get a 6 out of 10 from me. But in the next category, everything flips. What was cheap suddenly becomes a nightmare. The next category is easy, which can also be treated as enjoyable. Since the two are so similar, there's no point separating them. And here, horses immediately get 1 out of 10. Why? Because they require daily cleaning and daily riding. Some might say it's fun. You can ride around the map, explore, and sure, at first it's interesting. But when you have to do it every single day, and especially if you own several horses, it quickly stops being easy and definitely stops being enjoyable. On top of that, if you want to maintain 100% productivity, horses have a rather diverse diet, which means even more tasks to handle. So honestly, 1 out of 10 is already a generous rating. When it comes to the number of tasks, the complete opposite of horses are chickens, which only need grain to reach 100% productivity. And since this game is called Farming Simulator, and most players are here to drive huge combines and tractors, feeding chickens should be both fun and simple. Unfortunately, what isn't simple is loading egg pallets afterward, which at least for me is one of the most tedious and annoying tasks in the entire game. It's repetitive, it's clunky, and honestly, it's just not fun. That's why chickens get a 7 out of 10 in this category. Pigs, on the other hand, don't produce pallets, but their diet is even more complicated than horses, since they require 4 ingredients and you get to choose which ones. 3 of them are very easy and pleasant to grow. For example, corn, barley, and canola. The 4th ingredient, which only adds 5% efficiency, is root crops like sugar beets, and harvesting those is much more time-consuming and tedious. On top of that, the only silo that can store sugar beets is the train silo. If you don't want to use that one, you'll need conveyor belts or loaders to handle them. Luckily, since that ingredient only affects 5% of productivity, you only need to harvest beets once every few seasons. Even a small field will last you a long time if your pig herd isn't too big. Selling is also easy. You just load the pigs onto a trailer and drive them to the selling point. So, in the easy category, pigs get a 5 out of 10. Dairy cows, beef cattle, and water buffalo can basically share the same spot in the ranking because they only differ in how you sell them, specifically 1 extra click when loading them. As for feeding and upkeep, they all require the same set of ingredients to maintain 100% productivity. Feeding them is fairly complex since you have to mix various types of feed, but thankfully in the game you don't have to do it every day like in real life. You can fill the trough once, and if you don't have many animals, you'll have peace for about a week. Sure, there's a barn with an automatic feeding robot that mixes the feed for you, but that's still only one part of the process. They still have a complicated diet, and gathering silage or straw isn't exactly quick or effortless. Because of the number of steps involved, in the easy category, cows get a 4 out of 10 from me. Finally, we have sheep and goats, which I'm placing on the same level, since they eat the same food and their product selling process works identically. The only difference is the texture of the pallets and the animal's appearance. In terms of ease, they're quite similar to chickens. You have one type of feed and pallets to deal with. However, that one ingredient, grass, is much easier to prepare because all you need is a mower in the front and a forage wagon in the back. If you want to maintain 100% productivity all year round, you can also prepare hay, which adds only 2 extra steps. Either way, in this category, thanks to the simplicity of preparing their food, sheep and goats get an 8 out of 10 because grass grows endlessly, while grain, unlike grass, has to be replanted every season. And this is where the real fun begins, because in the plenty category, you'll see which animals can be raised almost endlessly. But before we move on to that category, let's quickly mention 2 animals that I didn't analyze in detail in this episode, the dog and the bees. The dog probably needs no explanation. It doesn't bring any profit and simply serves as a walking decoration on your farm. Bees, however, are a bit more debatable. Technically, they're listed under animals, but in practice, they function more like a factory or even a money generator. There's not much we need to do, just collect and sell the honey pallets from time to time. In the real world, beekeeping would be far more complex and require constant care. But in the game, it's basically an automated income machine rather than an animal you truly take care of. Back to our ranking, unfortunately, when it comes to plenty, our sheep and goats won't score as high as before. In this category, we're evaluating how large an operation you can realistically run solo solo without any mods. That means relying heavily on AI workers, which isn't entirely possible when it comes to hay or grass production. Sure, you can assign workers to mowing, windrowing, or delivering grass, but you'll always have to do the collection yourself, whether you're using bales or a forage wagon. On top of that, dealing with pallets on a large scale is far from enjoyable. For those reasons, sheep and goats get a 5 out of 10 in this category. Chickens, which didn't perform as well in the previous category, actually do much better here. Yes, grain requires more effort than grass, which regrows infinitely, but the entire process from planting to harvesting can be handled completely by workers. Meanwhile, you can act as a true farm manager, just giving orders and overseeing the work. Of course, not everything is perfect. Once again, we run into the issue of egg pallets, which can become a real nightmare at larger scales. Still, thanks to the possibility of full crop automation and relatively low involvement, chickens earn a solid 7 out of 10 in this category. I won't keep you in suspense. Horses once again get a 1 out of 10, although even this time that's a rather generous score. Not only do you have to clean and ride them every single day, something workers obviously can't do for you, but you also need to prepare hay manually. So yes, that rating is well deserved. What about cows? Even though you don't have to ride them, they still won't score high because most of the processes have to be done manually. You've got hay, which I already talked about when discussing sheep and goats, plus straw, which you collect in the exact same way, meaning again, no worker assistance. And on top of that, there's silage, which I covered in an entire previous episode, and I definitely recommend checking that one out. In short, preparing feed on a larger scale without mods or multiplayer help requires your personal involvement in nearly every step. Only if you have a barn with a feeding robot can you skip the TMR mixing. Otherwise, it's a real nightmare. Sure, selling milk or animals is fairly easy, but the feed preparation process itself is simply too time-consuming to give a higher score. So in the plenty category, cows get a 3 out of 10. Interestingly, pigs really have only one downside, which I already mentioned earlier, root crops. But that's just 5% of their diet, so even with a massive pig farm, it's not a big problem. I'm talking specifically about loading the beets, since the harvesting can be done by a worker. Technically, you can store them in the train silo, but that's a pretty niche solution most players probably won't use. As for selling, it's as simple as with beef cattle, you just load them up, and a worker can even drive to the sell point and back for you. Your only job is to load the trailer, which takes literally 2 seconds and 2 clicks. That's why in the plenty category, pigs get a solid 8 out of 10. And now the big question, which of these animals brings the highest profit, regardless of cost or effort? The answer honestly surprised me more than I expected. In a separate video, I analyzed everything, numbers, profits, efficiency, and let me tell you, the difference is absolute madness. If you want to find out which animal won the economic showdown, check out that episode. See you soon.